Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Reality Check. Our age is dominated by the ephemeral and the transient, yet the transcendent still manages to break through. Here at Reality Check, we inquire how to conserve the real in a time of deconstruction. Today, I want to talk about conservatism. I want to talk about the Socratic method. I want to talk about dialectics in general and what all of that has to do with Plato. And whoever best would be, or rather, there's nobody else better to talk to than Dr. Dan Sheffler, who is my guest today, and I'm very happy to welcome him on the show. Dr. Dan Sheffler holds a PhD in philosophy and an MA in classics from the University of Kentucky. He has taught and is teaching philosophy, Latin, Greek, history and composition, and the great books at the college and high school level. He writes and has written on Christian Platonism, on early Christianity, on conservatism, on beauty, and on Western civilization in general, and has appeared in the Catholic Philosophical Quarterly, the Questiones Disputate, Touchstone, the Classical Teacher, and the Imaginative Conservative. So I'm particularly thrilled to welcome Dan to the show today. Welcome.
You're too kind, Jan. I'm glad to be here.
Dan, we had great conversations over the summer, and I remember them fondly, but maybe give us a little bit of an introduction to yourself. What got you interested in studying, in entering academia and teaching, but also what got you interested in specifically the classics, and then maybe even more specifically into Plato?
Well, I went to the University of Kentucky as an undergraduate just because of family connections. And, I thought I was going to go into banking or something. So I think I started as an econ major. But right there in my first semester in college, I met David Bradshaw, who ended up being my dissertation director several years later. And he's an Orthodox philosopher, maybe fair to call him a theologian. And it really became a mentor of mine, and I became interested in philosophy through that. And then I sort of stumbled into finding out that the University of Kentucky, you might not think it, but people come from all over the world to study Latin and Greek there because there's a very active community in active Latin there, led by Terence Tunberg and Milena Minkova, and many others. And then I discovered that there's really this sort of epicenter of classics around Kentucky. So even though I didn't go to the University of Kentucky with that in mind, I didn't select it. I sort of stumbled into this community of love for classics and philosophy and Greek and Latin, and the rest is history. I just fell in love, and yeah, now that's all I do.
Very nice. Yeah, it's similar to Plato, right? Who wanted to get into politics and ended up, doing philosophy. You wanted to go into economics and end up doing philosophy. So there you have a nice parallel. I recall that we had very good discussions specifically about Plato. And you've published academically on Plato, but also a little bit more in a popular style on your blog. And I was just wondering, you did some work on the Socratic effect, what you call the Socratic effect, and I really like that. And you kind of, as far as I understand anyways, you want to show how Socrates' method of questioning creates the sort of inner gadfly, right? Not just for young minds, but I think for everybody that tries to think reasonably through things. So how would you reconcile this with our age? And what I mean by that is, thinking rationally is not something that I find is particularly common. Maybe now, after the election results have been public and ratified, it's ever more so clear that rational discourse is not always the case. I feel that our society tends more to like the easy soundbite, clear-cut answer, and not so much to the questioning, critical, or rational discourse. So, yeah, can you elaborate a little bit on this? How can the Socrates effect help us today?
Yeah, let me first define what I mean by the Socrates effect. I mean that, when you read Socrates, the Socratic dialogues of Plato, things like the Meno or the Euthyphro, the Ion, perhaps the Charmides, the questioning style of Socrates has a way of kind of wheedling itself into your brain. And if you let it take root there, it's never going to leave you alone again. Okay, so in some ways, Socrates and the particular style of questioning, at least as presented by Plato, maybe if we read the Xenophon version, it's a little it doesn't quite have the same magic, but it acts as a kind of mind virus. You get infected by this this inner need to question and not just let a particular concept go, not let a particular assumption go. But you always have this voice in the back of your head saying, well, what do you really mean by that? Could we define that critical term? Is that really true? Does that conclusion really follow from those premises? Does that contradict something else that I hold dearly? And I've certainly been infected by this mind virus, as I'm calling it. Partly tongue in cheek. I hope everyone understands. And in some ways, I think that Socrates effect is one of the animating principles of Western civilization. You see throughout classical culture throughout Europe, this willingness to ask those hard questions and not be content with dogmatically received assumptions, and in a way that you don't see in other cultures. However, that has always existed since the time of Socrates and throughout classical civilization with other strands of Western culture that are very happy to accept dogmatically received assumptions, to remain unreflecting. Socrates famously said that the unreflected life is not worth living for a human being. But there are, plenty of human beings that are perfectly willing and apparently think that that kind of life is perfectly worth living. So how do we reconcile that with contemporary culture? I frankly don't know. I think we experience a lot of people who are not bitten by the inner gadfly and have not allowed that to take root in their minds. And I also want to be clear about one thing, which is in that little essay that I wrote, I suggested that the effects of the Socrates effect, are not necessarily all good. Nietzsche was critical of this. That in some ways, that little inner voice in the back of your head that's always questioning and willing to take even your most deeply held assumptions and kind of put them to the test, that can sap you of vitality. It can sap you of resolve. I was just thinking about I have a sort of daily contemplative meditation practice, and when you're sitting there in prayer, it's not so helpful to have a little voice in the back of your head saying, what do you really mean by that? And is that really the best way of conceptualizing this particular, that can rob you of a certain calm or inner resolve. And so I don't want to suggest that, so I do think that in contemporary culture, the soundbite, purely unreflected political dogmatism that we see from a lot of people, that's, I think, an altogether bad thing. But I also want to be honest and caution about the potential dangers of getting too far down the road with this sort of perpetual need to do Socratic questioning.
So you're effectively invoking the Aristotelian mean, right? The balanced mean between the extremes in that sense. One thing that you said is I think strikes a chord in the sense that when I just kind of, ironically commented on the current political debates, it's often thought that, well, okay, so the conservatives are the dogmatic right-wing ones, the liberals are the free thinkers, right? The more creative, I don't know, future-oriented minds and thinkers. But what strikes me is that actually throughout the whole history of the West, and particularly in the Middle Ages, there was already this discussion between, well, dogmatism, right, and this rational inquiry, this idea of, well, how can we make truths of the faith, reasonably accessible, but at the same time, how can faith already orient and guide reason, not with kind of pre-packaged answers, but rather with a trajectory, right? So, how would you say can we achieve this balance then? So, if you talk about the little voice in your head that keeps nagging, when are the moments where you have to put that voice in its place? How do you discern those moments, and how do you discern the moments where you need to kind of amplify that voice that keeps nagging in your head? Do you have any practical guidance?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer. At exactly what point and how do we think that through? But I just want to point out that the very act of asking that question is the inheritance of Socrates. Right. So that's precisely the kind of question of, well, but how do I know where to draw that line, and how should I best think about what maybe it would be good to have some dogmas that I hold on to and I don't question, and maybe I should find some kind of balance, and how would I ever know? How would I figure that out? That's the kind of that we're doing the thing, right? While we're even questioning Socrates, we're being Socrates to Socrates, so to speak.
Which would make him happy, right? He would have.
I think so.
He would very much be a proponent of that. I'm talking about his own children during his apology, right? So, all right. Well, then let's not answer the question for now. But let's focus on something else within the question, something that is maybe embedded in the question. And this is something that is particularly striking to me, and specifically now, considering some strands of modern philosophy that pick up on this dialectical method, right, and that develop it further, but also maybe, I don't know, and maybe misapply it or over exaggerate it. And so, what I mean by that is plainly this: can we get truth out of pure negation? Right. So, what do I mean by that? Well, can we think about reaching a truth by just denying, right? In the sense that when you tell me something, well, I don't know, you have an objection to a statement that I make, or you have an objection to some dogmatic statement that I hold, God exists, right? And you counter this with counter arguments. You say, well, yeah, but evil exists in the world, right? How can God and evil coexist? Or how could God exist? How could we know, right? There's no final guarantee, right? Until we're dead, effectively. So there's this way of negating truths and dogmatic statements. Well, first of all, I guess my first question would be: do you think that that's what Socrates was doing? Number one, and second is: do you think that that's actually a useful way of going about things and finding truth? Those would be my two questions.
Yeah, so let's tackle that first historical one. It gets pretty tricky in the texts because, as I'm sure you know, we have some dialogues that are the so-called Socratic dialogues. Many people think that they came relatively early in Plato's career, although I think the evidence for that is a little bit shakier than some people want to make out. But then we have the so-called middle period dialogues, where Socrates is not just doing the questioning and poking and finding the contradictions and whatnot. But in fact, in places like the Republic, he gives these long speeches where he's very happy to give positive doctrines and a very positive argument for this is what's true and this is what we should believe, and is advancing a very definite theory. And even in the Socratic dialogues, he does do quite a bit of that, more than you might think from an initial freshman presentation of Socrates. In the Euthyphro, for example, he sort of nudges Euthyphro and wink, wink. He's asking Euthyphro questions, but in such a way where he says, well, could it possibly be that piety is actually a part of justice? Hint, I'm giving you the answer, man. Right. In several of the other Socratic dialogues, like the Lysis, for example, he makes some suggestions about what courage or the Laches, I'm sorry. He gives some suggestions about what courage might be. So I don't think that Socrates is doing only negation or only tearing down. I think that that's a misunderstanding of Socrates. And very famously in the history of philosophy after Plato, there was quite a bit of dispute about who was the real Socrates and what was the real Socratic method. And so you have a division between the new academics who claimed to be the true inheritors of the Socratic tradition and took things in an entirely skeptical direction, as against Plato and the Platonic Academy, which took things in a much more positive direction. To the deeper question, though, okay, can we get anywhere with a purely negating or a purely doubting style of thought? I think not. I think that is an entirely dead end. If all you ever do is question things, if all you ever do is come up with objections to what has been put forward, you can't actually generate a positive way of life. You can't actually put forward any actual philosophy. And in the political realm, I think we see this because you have critiques of various policies, but then of course the natural question is, well, so then what are we going to do? What's the alternative? Okay, and the thing is, often the negations are simply a way of masking there is a positive proposal in the background. There is a positive, I want to live my life in this way, or we do want to pass this kind of law, or I do want to believe in this particular worldview. And so I'm masking my real intention by putting up this front of only the objections and only the negations. And so I think you do need both. You need some sort of actual attempt to find wisdom and be a lover of wisdom and actually seek to try to understand what the truth is. William James, in a famous essay, The Will to Believe, which I don't want to endorse everything in the whole pragmatist philosophy, but I think he makes a very helpful distinction between two motives for doing philosophy or doing thinking in general. On the one hand, he says that people are motivated by the fear of dupery. They're afraid of being tricked, and they're afraid of being caught with their pants down, so to speak. That, oh, I believed in this lie this whole time. I was part of this cult mentality, and I can't believe that I was so much a dupe to this the whole time. And that can be good, right? I mean, it's good to be kind of self-aware and critical and not fall for things. Okay. But the much stronger motive and the much more noble motive, he says, is the actual love of finding out what the truth is. Right. And so, or rather than just trying to pull away all the ways in which you might have been duped, you have to then say, okay, but then what is the truth? What really is out there?
That's an incredible insight, and what I think there's a twofold insight in here. The one is precisely that the positive well, the love for wisdom and the strive for truth is or should be, right, the propelling action of seeking truth, not just what I don't want to be true or what I see as not being true, so the negation, but the affirmation. That's number one. But what I find even more striking, actually, in your exposition there is that you say that there is always a positive, and that's fascinating. So, especially again, political discourse is an easy one to bring up here. But even in personal conversation, I feel that that gets often forgotten. Is that somebody who just critiques, somebody who just denies, somebody who just attacks you, right? And even just your position, it oftentimes it doesn't seem like they want to give you another alternative, right? But they do. And so they kind of play with this, or it seems to me that they play with this illusion then of not really giving you a new dogma, right? But rather just destroying your dogma. Right? But they're also selling you another dogma underhand, kind of like beneath the surface. And this is what I find really interesting, especially in that I think it is it Rene Girard? I may misquote him here, but the whole idea that, myth never disappears. It just gets replaced by another myth. So, yeah, your comments.
Yeah, so or the idea that all the political ideologies that we have today are just Christian heresies that have been recycled and rebranded. And I think that there's some truth to that there underneath people do believe things, and they do. You have to when you wake up in the morning and you make decisions, you have a worldview. This was in the ancient world. This was a classic critique of the Pyrrhonists, who were a particularly radical school of skepticism and advocated this sort of complete suspension of judgment on all matters. And the idea was that was going to bring some kind of tranquility or peace within your soul, because the only things that really trouble us are our beliefs. And so if you could just sort of suspend belief in anything, then you're going to find this ataraxia or this undisturbed state of the soul. But of course, many people pointed out, well, that is itself a dogma, first of all. And then second, you just do. So you can kind of pretend that you are suspending your judgment, or you're only thinking critically, you're taking this skeptical stance, but you're not. You're going to wake up in the morning and you're going to make decisions, and those decisions are going to be made on some basis or other.
Yeah, no, that's quite right. Now, one of the things that you point to as well in regards to the Socratic method, and this is still kind of within the realm of what we've talked about now, but it offers a little bit of a different facet to it, is this epistemic humility, right? So this recognition that I'm ignorant, right? And I know that I don't know. I know that I know nothing, right? Which has over the history of Western philosophy and theology have sparked quite interesting debates and manifestations as well. So now, how do you think this humility is helpful? But I'm asking the question a little bit more specifically in a context where it does seem that interpersonal debates or even online debates can get quote unquote toxic very easily, right? They get emotionally charged. They get very personal. They get it's all about offending and not offending, and being offended and not being offended, and all of that. How would you approach this with this epistemic humility? So how can I remain epistemically humble, but at the same time stand in for the truth?
Great question. So the way that I see it, we've sort of focused on the negative aspects of the sort of Socratic kind of always questioning and always being critical and skeptical and whatnot. The way I see it, the Socratic mind virus, if you will, has its place at the beginning of your intellectual life, not at the end. It's not the goal of philosophy, but it is an incredibly useful thing at the beginning.
Okay.
And in fact, the way I see Socrates in the larger picture of Platonic philosophy, Socrates is almost even not doing philosophy yet. He's doing sort of a pre-philosophy, this ground clearing to teach you that you don't know everything, and that a lot of the things that you come to the table with naturally are a whole bunch of cultural baggage, maybe, or just assumptions, something that you heard on TV one time, or that your dad said when you were 7 and he didn't even really maybe mean it that seriously, but you just took it as the gospel truth, and then that got lodged in your mind somehow, and on and on and on. And so you come to adulthood out of childhood with all kinds of ideas that may or may not be coherent, that may or may not reflect what you really, truly, deeply believe, certainly might not be that smart. Okay. And so what Socrates does is teach you this humility to work through those ideas and have the freedom to let some of them go, and to the freedom to not take yourself so seriously. And say, yeah, maybe I'm just wrong about that. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. Maybe there's a term that I keep on using, and to quote The Princess Bride, this word you keep on using, I do not think it means what you think it means. You've sort of latched on to something, and maybe you're just wrong about it. And so that clears the ground. But then once you've cleared that ground, then you actually have to start doing philosophy, right? Once you've done the purgation, that pre-philosophy, well, now you have to build something new. Now you have to actually do the hard work of answering those questions that you've asked and trying to find real wisdom, trying to move forward, trying to figure out how should we use these terms, actually giving them good, solid definitions. And this is what I see Plato, the student of Socrates, actually doing and carrying that project forward, and Aristotle, for that matter, after Plato. And so in the context of online discourse, okay, I think we need both of those pieces. First, I see a lot of echo chamber mentality across, regardless of what political party you're in, or regardless of what ideas you hold. It's very easy to get in the Discord that with a bunch of dudes that agree with you, or get part of that Facebook group or whatever it is, where you're only exposing yourself to people who already think the things that you think, and they're giving you these confirming pieces of evidence and deploying words in the way that you use them. And it's very easy to just get locked into thinking that you're completely right, and you have no critical way to evaluate or escape that bubble. So I think Socrates and that intellectual humility is extremely useful for breaking you free from that. Okay. But again, to repeat, that can, once you've broken free, then what? Right? You still need to actually figure out what's true and stand up for what's true once you've come to some answers and discovered some wisdom, and actually advocate for what is true. You can't do both of those simultaneously. You can be humble about your assumptions and hold those assumptions lightly, and be genuinely convinced that, yes, after reflection, I do think I have found some things. I do think I've come to some answers.
Okay, very good. Well, this is quite striking categorization, and I really like it. The idea of the pre-philosophy, the questioning, and then what you call the hard work. That's a very good way of thinking about this. The hard work of actually finding the answers, establishing the answers, and maybe even gathering them maybe even synthesizing the answers. Would you say that like a completely new philosophy is possible in our days, or let's say in history in general?
Ooh, that's a tough question. I'm what you might call a sort of soft perennialist, and I use that term cautiously because there's a whole movement out there of perennialism, and I don't necessarily want to associate myself with with the capital P perennialism. But I do think there's an element in which there is eternal truth that when you look throughout all traditions, just human beings, human beings have generally discovered that 2 + 2 = 4. It doesn't matter whether you go to China, Africa, 3,000 years ago, whatever, we've figured out that 2 + 2 = 4. And so there are some basic truths that I don't think we're going to ever improve upon. Is what C.S. Lewis calls the Tao, right? In The Abolition of Man. Okay. However, just because, we've known for a really long time that 2 + 2 = 4, it doesn't mean that Newton or Leibniz couldn't come along and, figure out calculus. And so I do think there are some ways in which we can maybe make further progress in articulating the truth. There might even be things that we discover, that are deeply true. A simple example of this is the way that throughout ancient and medieval epistemology, they don't really have a space for probabilistic thinking. It's just not one of the categories in ancient logic. The best that they can say is, okay, certain pieces of evidence make something more likely or less likely. But by how much? Exactly how much more likely, right? But that's really, really critically important for a lot of contemporary public policy making, decision making in the modern world. A lot of our understanding of economics or how these things work, it has to do with very detailed and numerically quantified probabilistic reasoning. Okay, great. So I think we can admit that progress is possible in some of these forms of reasoning.
Okay, all right. One way that I like to think about this, and I think this is compatible with your lowercase perennialism, that's a good way of putting it, is how the church, the Catholic Church specifically, deals with her own tradition and magisterium. In the sense that the Catholic Church's magisterium doesn't change essentially because, specific or ordinary revelation has been accomplished, right? With the end of Christ's life on earth. But the problems remain, right? The problems of mankind remain, of every generation, of every individual soul. They remain. So the church has to, in every age, reapply the same tradition to new problems. And that's how I sort of like to think about the whole history of philosophy as well, is that all of philosophy gives us this very rich tradition, this almost treasure chest of traditions. Of some of those philosophies are contrary or even contradictory. So that's a given. But it gives us this rich treasure chest to always reoccurring problems, right? Always perennial problems of evil, problems of the meaning of life, ideas of the existence of the soul, what happens after death, right? Eternal life, right? Higher being, uncaused cause, whatever, unmoved mover. And so we can draw from this tradition, from this philosophical tradition, to always renew our tackling of these questions, but in turn also always rediscovering these traditions. And I feel like good academia does that. It unearths, maybe even thinkers that have not been properly studied yet, or elements of thinkers that have not been properly studied yet, have not really made, the object of a thorough study. And so that's the one hand, but then on the other hand also ties it into the greater complex of problems, right? So not just stay on that little academic isolated island of, okay, well, I'm going to do everything, on the, pre-established harmony of Leibniz. Like, this is going to be my thing, and I'm going to be the world-best scholar on that, right? But not really having an opinion on anything else, but rather tying that back into the larger question. And I feel that the good university, good academic exchange, does both of these things. Would you agree?
Yes. I think we have this sort of ever-growing treasure chest. So to tie back to your earlier question, that we keep on adding to this great conversation, but it gives us this stockpile to constantly be going back into. And I think that that's how the conversation grows. And in fact, we need to do that retrieval perpetually. Because, you mentioned there might be some a more obscure thinker that a study hasn't been done on. Well, let's suppose that a study is done on, I don't know, Damascus, some lesser read late Neoplatonist philosopher or something. Well, what's going to happen in 200 years? That study that's written in 2025 or whatever is going to be almost completely forgotten and inaccessible to whoever the scholars are in the 23rd century. Once we get to the Star Trek time period, whatever. So this is a task that we need to continually renew. It's not like once you do the scholarship, that's just done, because there's more books that are published every year than a person could possibly read in a lifetime, and so it's from that great mass of text, which admittedly most of that text is not worth reading in your lifetime. Okay. But you have to constantly be finding the gold and representing it for the current audience.
Yeah, no, very good. And then I think that's a hopeful way of thinking about it, because it also, again, it gives an antidote to this feeling of just being overwhelmed with information, right? And I think this is always helpful to distinguish between, well, information and actual knowledge, right? Information, yes, it's plenty, it's almost infinite, but, well, information is just information. It's unqualified, unreflected, just a homogeneous mass of knowledge. And that's not what philosophy is aiming at, right? Philosophy aims at wisdom. That's a very particular type of knowledge. So we're aiming at a very particular type of content within that large bulk of information. So I think it's very hopeful to put it in that way. Now,
right. And while I admitted earlier that there might be some possibility for growth or improvement, when it comes to wisdom, this very specific type of knowledge, as you indicated earlier, the questions are really perennial. It really always comes back to the same themes. How do you be a good person? What is virtue? What is the nature of the soul? What is a good life? Is there a God? How can we find union with God? And on and on.
Yeah. So that is the key word. That was my next question. Now we are at reality check, and one of the big themes that I try to tackle is really the primacy of the real, right? The primacy of, well, in philosophical terms, the primacy of being. You're very familiar with this. I don't know if something that you've written on would clash with this, because in one of you in one of the texts you show that the good that is depicted by Plato in his Republic and elsewhere is a principle beyond mere being. So the good is sort of primary to being. And while I think this is a technical question, I actually do think this has a particular effect on a mindset, and our mindset, and even on a conservative mindset. So you need to elaborate this a little bit. So how
Sure.
is and good related?
Yes. So this is a very famous component of the Platonic tradition, as against other historical philosophical schools. The doctrine that the good is beyond being, or in Plotinus's language, the one is beyond being. This is drawn from a famous phrase in the Republic, 509b, where Socrates, in connection to the famous allegory of the sun, where the good is the sun, the rays of light coming from the sun, he calls being and truth. Mm-hmm. It's not entirely clear whether he means those to be two separate things, being as one ray coming from the sun, and then truth as another kind of ray coming from the sun, or whether he means that as a hendiadys. That's a rhetorical term for where you are indicating one thing with two words. So maybe it's being hyphenated truth, But in any case, Socrates says that the good is beyond being. But he qualifies it by saying in excellence and power. And so you could take a deflationary reading of this and simply say that what's meant by this idea that the good is beyond being is simply that it's the good. So it's glorious and, excellent and powerful and okay. But that's not how it was taken in the Platonic tradition. The idea is that there actually has to be a ground of being that is not itself a being, and is not even being in general. Okay. And the basic idea goes something like this. In the Greek mind, being is not the same thing as just, to exist. It's always being something. So when we're talking about the verb is, right? The verb to be. So when I have a sentence where I say like, oh, look, the tree is, I point outside. I've got a window over here. The tree is. The Greek mind is naturally going to want to say, well, is what? The tree is a plant. The tree is alive. The tree is something. Okay. Because there's a always implied completion on the other side of that verb to be. Being is always being something. Okay. Second step is that being something, for Platonism always means having some kind of intelligible form, some kind of intelligible essence that defines the shape of what you are. So when I say the tree is alive, well, there's a pattern to what it means to be alive. And we can grasp that pattern with our minds. That's what's meant by intelligible. Okay. Third step, to have some kind of intelligible pattern or a shape, the technical term is form, okay, but that just means the shape of something. That's always a limitation on that thing. Form or shape means having edges, boundaries. To be alive means not being like a rock, a non-living thing. To be a plant means being not an animal. All right. So every being inherent in the concept of being is being something. Being something means having an essence or a shape, and that implies some kind of finitude or some kind of limitedness. Okay. So the key insight here is that underneath all of those very many finite forms of being, there has to be some one ground that is infinite and unbounded. And for Socrates, that is the good.
This, for me, prefigures two essential things, two essential insights that are developed in the Middle Ages. Number one, the real distinction, right? So the distinction between being and essence. So that the thing is and what a thing is. And it prefigures this in a very beautiful way, showing at once that the two must be distinct, but at the same time that they're also always related, right? For the Greek mind, seeking always the, well, what is the tree? Right? That's number one. And the other is the transcendentals, right? So truth, goodness, and being coterminous. Do you see this as a prefiguration as well? Or would you say that the medieval scholastics, negated the classic understanding that you just laid out?
The short answer is it gets quite complicated. Once we get into the weeds of scholasticism, it's going to be hard to have this conversation without getting into questions of translating between Greek and Latin, and then questions of the transmission of texts in different periods. So as I'm sure you know, Plato wasn't translated into Latin until Ficino in the 1400s. But nevertheless, there's an awful lot of Platonism transmitted through the Latin West, through Platonic authors like Augustine and then through Anselm. Dionysius, the whole corpus Dionysiacum was translated relatively early on by Scotus Eriugena and was extremely popular in the West. And so you have this very interesting mixed tradition about some of these matters. Okay. And the role of essay, and essentia. So that something is and what something is. So I don't know that we necessarily want to launch into an hour-long dishing out of all the different threads here. But I do think that this is an important precursor to many of those moves that are made later.
And then let me ask you a simpler question, which is it easier to be conservative as a Platonist or as an Aristotelian?
Aha. Well, I belong to the school of interpretation championed by Lloyd Gerson. If you've ever encountered the book Aristotle and Other Platonists, that thinks that Aristotelianism just is a form of Platonism. And so rather than seeing these two strands as antagonistic to one another, seeing Aristotle as simply the best student of Plato. And that's not to say that they don't disagree on particular doctrines here or there. But most of those disagreements only make sense from within a larger Platonic framework. So, for example, probably most famously, the one that most people have heard of if they've taken even an undergraduate philosophy class is the idea that Plato thinks the forms are transcendent and Aristotle thinks the forms are immanent. Okay. This comes down to a dispute between the schools whether form can be choris, this technical term that means separable. To even conceptualize the question of whether a form can be separated from its instance or not, you have to buy into the whole metaphysics of essences and forms and all the things about being that I just articulated, right? Which is the kind of cornerstone of Platonism. So in other words, to even ask that question, you have to already be a Platonist. And then that becomes a question within Platonism. So that's my short way of basically saying, I think all conservatives are Platonists. They might think that they're Aristotelians, or they might think that there's some sort of dispute between these two strands, but to be a conservative, broadly speaking, I think you have to be a metaphysical realist. So I like the name of your podcast. And to be a metaphysical realist, I think you have to be some kind of Platonist.
Very good. No, that is fair. And I mean that may or may not have contributed to the name of the podcast. So I'm glad that I have your approval there, though. Well, this is something that I find, especially in modern conversation, is very hard to uphold. Is this, well, the distinction between distinction and separation, right? We can distinguish a certain method of Plato and a certain method of Aristotle, or even charges of Aristotle against Plato. Mm-hmm. But as you said, the assumption is that underneath it cannot be really separated. And that's what I always bring this up when we talk about the soul, right? Especially in the medieval context, it's so common to distinguish the soul into intellect and will, right? But I always also remind the students, like, look, and both intellect and will are both the powers of, well, one soul. And in fact, your experience tells you precisely that. I don't just act as will. I don't just act as reason. I'm a human person. I have both. Right. And I think if we actually really reflect on our actions, we try to do this, we try to adopt this Socratic way of living life and be reflective about what we do, then we encounter that very quickly that it's going to be very hard to parse the decisions that we make exactly neatly into these categories of these are all of the reasonable things that tell me what to do, and these are all of the all of the knowledge on which I base my action, and then actually acting on it. So very good point there. So good. All conservatives are playing. So well, I mean, with that, we've really resolved one of the perennial
There you
questions.
go. You heard it here, folks. Right? Done.
That's right. Very nice. Okay, well, I would say as this is a good moment to close on. What are your future projects? What are you working on right now? What can we expect from you in the near future?
Well, I have a book coming out through the Hildebrand Press called Plato and Christian Personalism. which is about Plato's conception of the soul and the human person. And I try to argue that this is much more congenial to the Catholic personalist movement, thinkers like John Paul II, or Dietrich von Hildebrand, Hans Urs von Balthasar, Gabriel Marcel, that Platonism is really a kind of granddaddy of Catholic personalism, despite a sort of surface reading that might see Platonic dualism as some sort of proto-Gnosticism, fleeing the body, fleeing the unity of the human person. I argue that is a surface reading, and that there are much deeper alliances here between modern Catholic personalism and historic Platonism. I also have a regular newsletter that people can sign up for, and I try to get essays out every couple weeks. The website there is dtsheffler.com. And I do articles introducing Platonism. I've got a series right now where I'm trying to walk people through the tradition of Platonism, not just the philosophy of Plato, from a completely introductory standpoint, just assuming zero knowledge about philosophy or the tradition. I found that there's a lot of books out there where you can get Plato's thought or an introduction to Plato, but there's not very much out there about the tradition of Platonism, which really grew significantly beyond just the dialogues. And there's a lot to Platonism that you would not at all guess. It's like you can kind of, if you do the detective work, you can kind of find some of these doctrines here and there in this like obscure passage of the Timaeus or something like that. But it's not at all obvious. And so I'm trying to just lay out the basic ideas of Platonism. But I also write about, contemporary cultural criticism, or just, sometimes just something that I see on the news will annoy me, and I'll write a post about it, get it off my chest.
Good. Yeah. Good. And well, that is, thank you for having us share in that. So keep up the good work. Dan. So thank you so much for your time today. This was a very riveting discussion, and I think gives a good insight into some of the major concepts of Plato and beyond. So I'll make sure that I'll link all of what you just mentioned also in the description down below. I'm looking forward to further conversation with you, that's for sure. Thanks for all of your time, and I hope to see you next time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.